Hello, my name is Kayla, and I am an international finance student from California. And today, my term paper's topic is about Eurobonds in Africa and the harming effects that Eurobonds have on Africa. So, as mentioned before, the paper's focus is on the presence of Eurobonds in the continent of Africa. Africa was very eager to get into the international finance market as international investors would lead to more money with bigger opportunities for the country. More specifically, in theory, Eurobonds seem to be a beneficial debt investment to overall help African economies and countries to become more developed, increase the quality of life, which would overall result in less of a reliance on foreign aid. However, my term paper will focus on how Eurobond ended up doing more harm to some of these countries than what governments and investors originally planned or thought. So in recent years, there has been an increasing popularity of Eurobonds within sub-Saharan Africa, and they were both appealing to governments and investors as the governments were in need of the funds and investors were happy about the high returns of these bonds. So even though these African countries had the perception of high risk due to poor credit ratings, this didn't deter the investors from investing. So therefore, my paper will analyze how Eurobonds are actually damaging to African countries while explaining how these investments have hurt the economies rather than lead to well-developed countries. So for my introduction, using debt bonds in international markets is not a new concept. However, the use of debt bonds within Africa has become a fairly recent thing. Over the years, the popularity of Eurobonds has grown and become more common. And African countries have turned towards Eurobonds because this new foreign currency allows African countries to borrow in larger amounts, allowing these countries to diversify their funding sources. And the obvious would be that these Eurobonds are improving the economies, furthering the country's infrastructure. However, there is an unfortunate truth that the Eurobonds are doing more harm in African countries rather than improving them. And the more that African countries seek to use Eurobonds, the more damage it will have on the economy. So therefore, my paper will focus on the negative effects of Eurobonds. So it seems that some of the African countries that have used or turned to Eurobonds as an investment to help develop their country are blindsided of the potential damages that these bonds will do in the long run. The reason that these bonds end up being so harming to these economies is because they are offered at a higher interest rate with high coupon payments with shorter maturities. So basically, this means that the government has a shorter period to use the costs wisely and or the funds wisely, and they will also be paying a periodic interest. And the average Eurobond in Africa lasts about 10 years with an interest ranging between 5% all the way up to 16%. And so this is why the investors are so eager to invest in these bonds. And it seems as if African countries are not realizing the great responsibility that comes with paying these investors by a certain time with such high yields. So overall, it's important for these African countries to realize how damaging these bonds will end up being on their economy before they continue to acquire more debt. And unfortunately, there has already been a noticeable trend that African countries are struggling to repay these bonds. Therefore, this results in a decrease in tax revenues, and they've ended up in a continuous cycle of the money that they collect from tax, they are using it to pay back these bonds at such high interest rates by the maturity. And debt servicing is consuming an average of more than 20% of the government's revenue, leaving very few resources for developmental needs. And more specifically, the sub-Saharan African governments, their debt burdens are escalating at a faster pace than anywhere else in emerging markets, increasing the risk of further burdens and defaults. And realizing how untenable these current Eurobonds in Africa are, can help governments make better decisions when it comes to selling bonds in the future. And hopefully they will take into more consideration how these interest rates and maturities, which short mature dates, will affect them in the future. And this idea that that Eurobonds aren't actually helping Africa is not a new idea. Obviously, from a surface level, people will see Eurobonds as a win-win situation for both the investors and the African countries, being that the Eurobonds is obviously helping the economy to develop. However, it isn't until you take a deep dive into this matter and actually analyze what's going on, the situation, till you realize that these Eurobonds aren't actually doing this for African countries. And other financial analysts and researchers have also noticed this trend. And one of the biggest problems with these Eurobonds is that the short to medium maturity, the money from these bonds are used to finance long-term projects. And this is where it ends up harming the economies of these countries. And as Smith stated, if these proceeds of borrowing are well invested, economies can grow and standards of living can improve. However, the quality of investment decisions vary across the continent of Africa. And this is where the damaging effects of Eurobonds lie. It's basically due to the overall misuse of the funds. And I guess I will skip most of the content of my paper and talk about just the data that I will use continuing on this paper. So in order to further my research and prove how Eurobonds are negatively affecting countries in Africa, financial and analytical data is needed. So the first data that I will collect will show how much money the African governments are acquiring in correlation to the improvement of the infrastructure of that country. And this data would show if Eurobonds were being used wisely and creating a difference rather than creating a deep grave of debt within the country. The additional data that I will use for this research is how a country's debt to GDP ratio has changed over the course of 10 to 15 years. And this will be a significantly important measurement, as a debt to GDP ratio can typically imply a country's ability to pay its debts. And also it will show how well the country is doing in producing goods in comparison to what it owes. And the reason why I want to collect the data of debt to GDP ratio over the course of 10 to 15 years is because showing how it will show how the debt to GDP ratio is worsening as the countries get more money and how it actually isn't improving. And the last collection of data that is important for this research is tax revenue. Finding out how much people's tax money is just going straight towards repaying its debt instead of rebuilding the society will be very crucial to prove how these Eurobonds aren't helping these countries become what they could become. And this is why Africa has been having a problem with seeing a increase in their economy and development and overall standards of living, because people's tax money cannot be reinvested into the economy. Instead, it's going straight towards repaying these debts, which is creating this vicious cycle, which is not allowing the economy to improve or go any further. So that is all that I will talk about for my term paper for now. And so I thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed.